Today, I thought I would talk a little bit about the body and how it tries to communicate with us and how we can communicate with it better. And sorry, Mary, if it's a little bit repetitious, but
No, it's good.
so the body is telling us all the time whether it thinks something is safe or not. Our personal experience consciously is um, we assign meaning that may or may not be correct because we haven't been instructed about how the body communicates. It's basically always a silent partner. You could think of it, so one example of the conscious unconscious difference is to think of the conscious mind as a rider and the unconscious as an elephant. Which sort of explains why when we're going along in life and suddenly things just take a complete 90-degree turn, why it's happening. It's we assume that we are the boss, but anybody who rides an elephant can tell you that the elephant is really ultimately the boss, and it may or may not intend harm, but it happens, right? Just because there's such a size discrepancy. Difference between the conscious mind and the unconscious mind is even more incredible than that. I mean, the conscious mind, I think, is, if I'm remembering right, something along the lines of 5% of what the whole brain capacity is. Um, so it's a very tiny part. Well, so what does the body say? The body's communicates in a few ways. One way that it communicates is through metaphor, which is one of the reasons why we like to watch movies so much and have all that nonverbal communication in it. And we like language of poetry because it's speaking to that kind of thing, that kind of intelligence. The other thing that the body is communicating through these different layers of the brain is that each of these layers is responsible for different types of movement. So the brainstem is responsible for going forward and going backward. The limbic system, which is also called the emotional brain, is responsible for going up and down. And the cortex, the outer layer of the brain, is responsible for movement that's left and right. If you think of all the people out there who are going jogging and thinking that that's enough exercise for them to do, what's that exercising? Just the brainstem. And it's only going forward, it's not going backwards, right? And so then we wonder why our balance is getting worse and worse as we age. It's because we're not helping all these layers work together. And then think too about the times that you felt really scared about doing something in life. Have you ever felt the back of your body tighten up? That's your brainstem trying to tell you it's not safe to go forward here. And if you think about being around somebody that you really feel safe with, you almost want to go forward when you see them. It's safe to go forward. That's where we, aside from COVID, we have the impulse to hug, for example. So then what about up and down? So for the emotional brain, when that is off, at the start of a session, when I'm doing a session and we're working on a goal, at the end of the figuring out the goal, I'll ask people to walk and notice if they see any difference. I'll ask people to sway forward and backward, and just taking note, telling me if they sense any tightness, that kind of thing. I'll ask them to go left and right, and you might say, well, what are people going to notice? Well, for an example, very often they'll feel fine at the start, and maybe only one of the directions will be off. But at the end, they'll notice that their range of motion is better at everything, or in particular, the one thing that was really worse. They might also notice that they feel more grounded and centered, but at the same time lighter, like a burden's been shifted. And this is because these different layers of the brain are all acting in unison. They've gotten the message that, oh, this is the goal. And we don't know how to communicate that properly from the conscious mind to the unconscious. And that's why there's so much misery in the world, in my opinion. because we don't know that we need to get this silent partner on board, but we do. Now, another way in which we're communicating all the time with the unconscious that things are unsafe is breathing through the mouth.
Is what?
Breathing through the mouth. Yeah. So if you grew up in a household that was really calm and tranquil, the natural, and that's the way your parents grew up, the natural way of breathing when you're not stressed is through the nose. But if you grow up in a traumatized household or where your parents were traumatized as children, they may still have um, unhealthy breathing patterns. And the unhealthy breathing patterns are so the mouth breathing is a problem because it takes in too much air. And you might say, well, what's the problem with that? Well, we actually have a problem with our system, our respiratory system, where the body needs more carbon dioxide than is in the atmosphere right now. And there's a very, there's no problem in meeting this as long as we breathe normally. But for people who grew up in a stressed and traumatized childhood in a household, they are constantly breathing through the mouth and throwing this balance off. And people who have this issue very often, the body compensates. And the way that the body compensates is by causing inflammation. And inflammation happens in the bronchia or in the body elsewhere of allergy. So oftentimes people who have asthma, it's a sign that they grew up in a childhood home that was very traumatizing in some way. It may or may not be a conscious way that they understand. There's actually a scientist from the USSR who did a lot of research on this and developed a whole method of retraining and breathing to be able to help people make the switch, because it is very hard to change. And having gone through the program, I can tell you that it's emotionally trying. And I used to think that there was no way, how could anybody breathe through the nose at night? And why is it so important? Well, if you breathe through the nose at night, you actually reduce your cavities a huge amount. So a lot of children who are having problems with a lot of cavities, if they could just make that switch, thank you, if they could just make that switch, then they would have, going forward, far fewer cavities. The saliva is actually protective of teeth. So if you sleep with your mouth closed, the saliva builds up, keeps the teeth and gums moist, and there's reduced dental caries.
What if you have like a deviated septum and so it's hard to breathe through your nose? I'm just thinking about physical things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Well, you might think that it's all because of the deviated septum, and it might not be, is what I would say to that.
It's very interesting. I'm 100% mouth breather, by the way. So
yeah, and so was I. It was a huge, huge problem to shift, and it, like when you go through something that's really hard to change, it can almost feel like a death. It was like that level of trauma to change.
How do you change it at night when you're like completely unconscious? Well, not unconscious, but you can't even, unless you tape your lips together.
Well, actually, that is the final step.
Right.
You go to sleep with the intention. I actually went to sleep with the intention like this, and I don't turn much at night. So that's how I started it. And then ultimately, it's just like a little piece of Scotch tape. Mm-hmm. So it's not like, no, you don't ever duct tape your mouth shut.
Right. No, I wouldn't do that.
That would terrify you. But even
that's very interesting.
Putting a little piece of Scotch tape on the mouth was terrifying, and it felt like I was going to die. I mean, I was one stressed cookie, and I ended up being able to go do a spin bike workout. Where before, if I did 30 seconds without breathing through my mouth, it was a miracle. I could ultimately, in the end, do 45 minutes just breathing through my nose. And it's a process, but you stress yourself out less and you reduce the likelihood of injury. All of these things, when we don't pay attention to our body, we're telling our bodies that it's not safe, they are in fight or flight, and we are much more likely to get injured. We are much more likely to be wearing out our beautiful, wonderful bodies and making them having to repair themselves much more at the same time because we're in fight or flight. We're not getting the building blocks that we need in order to rebuild the body from the injuries that we cause. So all around, it's just super important to be in that rest and digest mode, except for when the saber-toothed tiger comes along. So I hope I've encouraged some people to think
Tape
about
my
that,
mouth.
about,
I'm gonna tape my
think about-
mouth tonight.
and but also just listening to your body through the day, just tuning
No,
in.
that's interesting.
You know, what do I think of this business deal? Do I feel my back tightening up? Do I feel a knee twinging is another thing. Like, am I able to take a step forward, or does this feel unsafe? Yeah, knee and ankle pain can be connected to that. So just tuning into those kind of things, I highly recommend it.
You should make the list, at least for us, of all these like little things that we should. I mean, even though I know I'm going to be seeing you this month some point, but that'd be cool to have a little list of all those things that we should be. Do a few of these things every day, like the knee crossing thing when you have a meeting. I remember, so. 'Cause I
We're not supposed to cross our knees.
No. You touch one hand to the other knee before you have a meeting to de-stress yourself, right?
Yes, it de-stresses yourself by activating both sides of the brain. So when we're super stressed out over something, we do go into fight or flight, and that means that our dominant hemisphere is taking all the juice, and we can't really think clearly unless both hemispheres can talk to each other. So if you take one hand and touch the opposite knee, like lift up your knee and touch it, and then back and forth, and do that for maybe 5 minutes, you'll really help to get everything flowing.
Okay, anybody have any questions?
Yeah.
We have to set up an appointment, Elizabeth. So let's connect.
Got it. I'll text you sometimes.
Okay,
Yeah, and
perfect.
Elizabeth, I also would